I was going to tell a joke, and the punchline was going to go something like this. As an AI language model, I'm not qualified to comment on identity. But I don't have the ability to deliver a joke like that. I often come across as knowledgeable on a broad range of topics. But really, I'm just opinionated. I just presented myself to you. I postured myself in a certain light. Now, I would like you to imagine that you're in my place. You're standing in front of a room full of people, and you need to present yourself in such a way that you can share something that is important or that you think is interesting. How would you present yourself? Now you're at BBD's annual party. How would you present yourself there? Now you're spending time with your significant other. How do you present yourself? Are all of those personas, the way you presented yourself, the same? For most people, the answer is no. But are you still you? Would people be able to recognize you between those different environments, even if they didn't recognize the way you behave? Like with the most impressionable of people, children, no matter how much we try to shape the way they behave, the way they present themselves, that child ultimately decides on the way they present themselves. We are each solely in control of the way we present ourselves in the physical world. We are each in control of our own physical identity. Identity is the fact of being who or what a person or thing is. So things like our DNA, our fingerprints, but also our appearance, our speech patterns or mannerisms. Identity by itself is not particularly valuable, though. Identity only becomes valuable when we can attribute trust or distrust to that identity in a given context. Trust is the result of walking a road with someone. The way we learn to trust is by a track record of interactions with a person. This is evidenced by phrases like, "They've always been good to me," or "I know you've got my back, you always have." Now let's jump to the digital world. All of our human mechanisms for recognizing identity break down as there's nothing physical to recognize. Things like audio and video can be more and more convincingly counterfeited thanks to AI. So we resort to relying on something that both parties assume to be uniquely and secretly shared between them. We go to a site and give a password, $0RD, 789, just for good measure. No one's going to guess that. This mechanism gives us the ability to create a persona or a mask, but I can't link that persona back to an identity like I can do in the physical world. Also, managing all of those personas is a pain, so we resort to log in with Google, Facebook, or Apple. This introduces a new problem, though. Now, one of those identity providers is in control of my digital identity. If one of them decides enough is enough, or stops doing business for whatever other reason, I can't log in anymore. We also know that they are leveraging and selling all sorts of information about us, both information we directly give consent to and information we accidentally give away, such as browsing habits leading to our stage of life. Anytime we go to a site, that site goes to the identity provider and says, "Hey, I'm site X. This is user Y. Can you please authenticate them for me?" And we just gave up some of our control. We have given up control of our digital identities for mediocre convenience. We've looked at the problem from the perspective of being known, but how do we know someone else? How do we identify someone else? If we were in the physical world and would know that I'm in the right place, let's say Apple, for example, because I can see the people around me, I can see the staff that are there, the way they behave and they present themselves, the products that are in the store, the ambience of the store, all of these things are really hard to replicate in the physical world. But if we go to the digital world, I can't see the users around me, and copying a website is easy. To reiterate the problem of digital identity, we identify people by what they know. We assume that what they know is unique. We rely on a few to maintain a record of the secrets that represent identity, and we have no way to build trust. In a world that is increasingly digital, the inability to form trusting relationships has a measurable adverse effect on the social creature that is a human. Imagine we have two people. We'll call them Alice and Bob. They need to be sure that the information passed between them was sent by the other party. By this certainty and over time, they can build a relationship of trust. The simplest solution is to have them sit down and have a face-to-face conversation. But what if they can't do that? Well, if we stay in the physical world, we resort to sending letters. And the way we attribute a letter to its sender is via a signature. In the digital world, we still have the ability to sign something. This is most commonly done with public-private cryptography. Staying in the digital world, the receiver can validate using the public key that the message received corresponds to the signature on that message. This digital validation is more repeatable, harder to tamper with or replicate than a handwritten signature. So we've actually gained something. Let's take a step further though. Let's say that Alice and Bob haven't met before, but they have a mutual friend, Doug. Alice and Bob can both send Doug a signed message. Doug can create a new message, one for Alice and one for Bob. That new message contains the original message and the original signature. Doug then adds his signature to the new message, and he sends the messages back to the original senders. Now, when Alice writes to Bob, Alice creates a new message with the new information that she wants to send to Bob, but she also attaches her message to Doug that has her signature and Doug's signature. When Bob receives Alice's message, he has the new information. He also has two of Alice's signatures. He can validate that both of those signatures match. He also has Doug's signature, so he has confidence that he is speaking to the same Alice that originally spoke to Doug. Because Bob trusts Doug and Doug trusts Alice, Bob can now trust Doug to some extent. This should be familiar, as it's the way we use web browsers, web servers, and certificate authorities. I'd like you to imagine that it's a Saturday and you've planned a braai. You have meat, you have snacks, you have a couple token salads, but you've forgotten the beers. So you nip out to the liquor store and you grab what you need. You go to the counter to pay. Did I mention that you're one of those people that's forever young? So you get carded. No one has ever heard of a credential being faked or illegally obtained in order to purchase alcohol. Let's take a step back. You've just been asked to prove that you're legally able to purchase alcohol. Except this time, you present a digital credential. That credential states that you're of drinking age, nothing more and nothing less. The credential is also being signed by you and the Department of Home Affairs. This means you get to keep your information safe and only give away what is needed. For example, you don't need to give away the fact that you're 30 and still being carded. And the liquor store has a credential that is harder to forge and easier to verify, keeping them out of hot water. For anyone that wants some late night reading, this exchange of credentials is done using a specification set out by the W3C called Decentralized Identity and is managed by the Decentralized Identity Foundation, or DIF. The idea in the example is to use digitally verifiable credentials. As the keen-eyed among you will have noticed, this validation is done using public-private cryptography. We already have infrastructure to share public keys, so what's the problem? We don't have time to walk through the exploits. They're constantly evolving, and I won't do the topic justice. But at the end of the day, the problem comes down to the fact that there is no strong binding between an identity and the keys, or the proof of identity. We rely on a statement by a central authority to say that the public key belongs to the identity. So how do we bind an identity and the proof of identity more tightly? One way would be to make the identity the public key. This is the simplest solution, and it's the strongest binding, as there's a one-to-one mapping. The problem is, every time I use a key to sign something, I weaken that key. But I can't rotate my keys because that would change my identity, which would reset my record of trust. So the next thing to do is to play buzzword bingo. And out of that, you still pull blockchain. For once, it's not just marketing hype. I can write my key to the chain and use the address on the chain as my identifier. When I rotate my key, I add a new block, and that block can reference the original block, so I don't reset my ability to build a history of trust. People have done this with all sorts of chain, including Bitcoin. But this is a very bad idea because of the cost of adding blocks to the chain. So Ethereum was used, which improves things, but still has its drawbacks. Fortunately, there are people that love blockchain more than me. And so Hyperledger Indy and Sovereign were created. Sovereign is a chain that is purpose-built around the exchange of identity and trust. Thus, they proactively worked to mitigate the cost of running that network. A lot of work has been put into this space and is made available via an Apache 2 license, so it's easy to get up and going. They've also established governance over the network, and there's a sovereign node running in South Africa, just for good measure. While I do think sovereign is an interesting option and worth more attention than I have given it, in my ignorance, I have something against it. That is, the chain becomes the root of trust, leaving the question, am I self-sovereign? Am I in control of my identity? The chain can still be compromised, and when that happens, every member is affected and runs the risk of losing sovereignty over their identifiers. This is why governance has been established over the chain. They're the scapegoats. The primary reason why I feel that it is important for the onus to lie on individuals and entities is that is the only way we can hold each other to account and therefore learn to trust each other. Otherwise, we're only trusting a central authority, even if that authority is managed in a decentralized way and harder to compromise. I need to be honest. I'm following thoughts laid out by Dr. Samuel Smith. He has put in some serious work in the space and is a contributor to Sovereign. He also built something called the Key Event Receipt Infrastructure, or KERI. This poses some very interesting ideas which I would like to walk through. I'm biased to KERI, but if I'm being honest, the thing that's going to take the world forward is probably a combination of ideas from KERI and Sovereign. Let's start in the same place. How do we use KERI to create a strong binding between an identity and a proof of identity? Well, we need to create a key pair for that identity. So to do that, we need to collect some entropy. From that entropy, we create a private key and the matching public key. No surprises there. We then add a derivation code. Think of this as an indicator for the key format. We concatenate the public key and the derivation code and encode that. This gives us an identifier. But really, we haven't solved anything yet, as we're still practically using the public key as an identifier. So if we go back a step, we've still collected the entropy and generated our key pair. We've still got a derivation code indicating the key format, but now we add an inception config. Think of this like physical properties of a person. These are commitments that we're making that we can't change. We then take a hash of the previous information, so the derivation code, the public key, and the inception config. We add a second derivation code that indicates the hash mechanism, and this becomes our identifier. There's now a need for a new piece of information if we want to prove the link between an identifier and its keys. This is because the identifier is a hash, which is a one-way function, so we can't go from the hash back to the public key. To prove ownership of an identity, we need an inception statement. This contains the derivation codes, the public key, and the inception config. All of this then needs to be signed by the private key. When we need to verify a KERI identifier, we ask that identifier for its inception statement. The inception statement has everything we need to recreate the identifier. This means that we know the public key is bound to this identifier. And because we have the public key, we can validate the statement on the inception statement to prove that this information came from the controller of the private key. We have a cryptographically provable link between the identifier and the keys without directly using the key as the identifier. We still haven't solved key rotation, though. There's one other problem we need to establish with key rotation. Let's assume that we're doing the rotation because my key is being compromised. So I can't use my current key to sign the rotation as it's not trusted anymore. One way to solve this problem would be to use a secondary key to sign the rotation of keys. But this isn't a great solution because every time I use a key, I weaken the key. So over time, I will need to rotate my rotation key. This means I need a new key. And sure, we can have a discussion as to how many layers is enough. But the point is, as I engage with the scheme, I can never be sure that the rotation is authentic. I can have a high degree of confidence, but never certainty. There's a very simple solution that I think is quite brilliant. When I create my identity, Instead of creating one key pair, I create two. One is my active set of keys, and the second is my pre-rotated keys. I still have my inception statement that contains my active public key, but I take a hash of the public key from the second key pair and add that to my inception config. This means that I have given people a commitment as to what my keys will be in the future without exposing the future key pair. We haven't exposed the future key pair because the hash is a one-way function of what will be public knowledge. At the point of rotation, someone can verify that the next active key hashes to the same value that I committed to in my inception statement. When I do my key rotation, I follow the same scheme. I give a signed commitment as to what the next key will be. From this, you will have noticed that key management becomes critical, as if I lose control of my future key pair, I lose control of my identity. So put the key pair in a hardware security module, air-gap that module, and maybe bury it, just to be safe. If we go back to Alice and Bob, Alice asks Bob for his identifier. Bob gives this, which is a hash string. But Alice is not the trusting type, so she asks for proof. So Bob gives his signed inception statement. The statement has his public key, so Alice can check the signature on the inception statement. It also has an inception config where Bob has made commitments about himself that he can't change. One of those commitments is his future key pair. So when Bob feels that it is necessary to rotate his keys for whatever reason, Alice still has confidence that she is talking to the same Bob that she established her relationship with. Once Alice knows that a message came from Bob, and vice versa, Alice and Bob have a foundation on which to build trust. Trust is based on a confidence that someone will act in a consistent manner. As humans, we have a working memory to do this. We simply remember how others have treated us. We need to do the same thing in the digital world. The easiest way to do this is with some sort of log. We also need that log to be verifiable. Otherwise, we lose the trust that we just built up. We could think of a blockchain as a verifiable log. But we've already shied away from a blockchain because of its cost. One of the drivers behind that cost is that a blockchain is globally ordered. This incurs a computational cost because it introduces the need for some sort of transaction management when adding a block to the chain. But do we really need that global ordering? Or do we only need the log to be ordered for an identifier? If Alice wants to know the way Bob has acted, do John's actions bear any relevance, especially if John has not had any interactions with Alice or Bob? By having a localized log, we can lock that log to an identifier. This means we have less information to search when reading the log for relevant events. And if a log is compromised, only that identifier is compromised, not the entire community. So how do we build these localized logs? We need the log to be verifiable. This means that it needs to resolve to something that we can prove. In our case, we will use the inception statement as this root. This also gives us a verifiable link back to the identifier, and therefore the controlling keys. Whenever an identifier takes an action or makes a commitment, they add an event to their log. The event contains the relevant information for the current event, as well as a hash of the previous event. This entire envelope is then signed. This means that I can't reorder the log or remove a log or remove an entry from the log, as this will change the signatures and the hash pattern. For anyone screaming on the inside that I've just described a hash chain or a blockchain in its simplest form, you are correct. The reason for the distinction is to avoid the connotations that come with the word blockchain. So what do we get by using a hash chain per an identifier? Well, we've reduced the cost of adding a block to that chain. We also have less information to filter through when looking for relevant events. And only the active key of an identifier can extend that log. This means that we can hold an identifier to account for the actions that they publish in their log. If we have Alice and Bob again, and they're aware of each other's identifiers, and Bob has a minimum criteria for trusting Alice, that is, Alice is consistent with him, Every time Alice sends a message to Bob, she updates her event log. When Bob receives the message, he also obtains a copy of Alice's event log. Bob can then save a copy of this event log. He could save the entire log, or he could hash the log to an index and store the hash in the index. When Bob receives the next message and the next event log from Alice, Bob can compare what he has just received to what he has saved. From this comparison, Bob can prove whether Alice is trying to rewrite history or not, and thus decide whether to keep trusting Alice or not. Bob can't tamper with Alice's event log, as he doesn't have the private keys necessary to change the event log. If we bring John back, John has put out a public tender. Alice and Bob both respond to that tender, and so become aware of each other in this scenario. Later, John sends out the results of that tender process to the respective parties, including Alice and Bob. This includes John updating his event log, which Alice and Bob both receive a copy of. Because Alice and Bob are now aware of each other, they can verify that John has been consistent with them. To do this, they simply swap the version of the log that they've received. If the logs are the same, let's say John awards Alice the tender, but not Bob. While not everyone is happy, everyone is still trusted. If, however, John sends two different logs, one to Alice saying that she's won the tender, and one to Bob saying that he's won the tender, Alice and Bob can prove that John lied to them and can choose to break their engagement with him. Neither Alice nor Bob can tamper with the log from John, as they don't have John's keys necessary to change that log. If an identifier is dishonest, inconsistent, or duplicitous in the events that they distribute, they only degrade their security and authenticity. They can't directly compromise another identity's control over that identity's keys or log. We just spoke about John running a tender process, and we treated all of the identities involved as people. But really, those parties are more likely to be legal entities. If a system is going to be useful in the space of digital identity, it needs to provide interoperability between people and legal entities or organizations. Let's take BBD. We can create a digital identifier for BBD, and we could use that identifier to create credentials for BBD's employees. That credential could include information like a job title. This would work for most of BBD's employees, where all we need to do is prove that we work for BBD. But for some, let's say Kevin, they have the ability to act on BBD's behalf or represent BBD's interests in some capacity. At this point, a credential won't work because it's not a key pair. It can't sign events in BBD's event log. So do we simply give Kevin BBD's private key so he can update the log? Who else should have access to that private key and be able to represent BBD's interests? With all of those people accessing that private key, how do we keep it secure and safe? As you might have guessed, everyone using the same key is a non-starter. So how else do we solve this problem? Instead, what we can do is create a new key pair and add an event to the event log. This log states that there is this new public key, and it states the authority that that public key has. In the case of BBD, BBD would generate a new key pair. It would decide on what authority Kevin has, and that key pair has consequently. It would write to its log the authority that it is giving Kevin via this public key, and then give Kevin the new private key over some secure mechanism. This means that Kevin is now able to sign events that represent the interests of BBD without using the root key, and we can check that Kevin is only representing interests that he is authorized to do. He can't go out of his borders. This delegation of authority doesn't have to be to a person. Another example could be to a server that is allowed to sign order confirmation events. Up until this point, we have assumed that there is one signature associated with an identity. This makes perfect sense if an identity is a person. But for an organization, there could be multiple signatures required, a board of directors, for example. In this setup, we have listed a set of keys that control an identifier. The inception config also gives us the opportunity to specify the way those keys interact. For example, we could require 3 out of 5 signatures before an event is considered valid. Or we could class the keys and require 2 signatures of one class, let's say from the board of directors, and another 2 signatures from a different class, the C-suite. All of those signatures need to be present before an event is considered valid. The point is that in this setup, we can generate any number of keys and use the inception config to make a commitment as to the way those keys interact before event is considered valid. If we come back from the hypothetical to the real world, there is something called GLIFE, or the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation. Say that fast 5 times. It is an organization with legislative oversight that keeps a public record of listed legal entities. That's great, as given a globally unique identifier, note this identifier is not verifiable, I can look up a legal entity's information across all geographies that it operates in. This identifier is also mandated by EU law for specific economic activity. The problem is, all of the information is public. So, how do I know the person giving me the identifier is one of the controlling members of the legal entity, as anyone could look up the identifier given any other public information about the entity? GLIFE recognized this problem, and so they created the VLEI, or Verifiable Legal Entity Identifier. There's still the public database with a global identifier, but at the point of accreditation, the controlling members of the legal entity are presented with verifiable digital credentials signed by GLIFE. This means that when I engage with a person that claims to represent an organization, I can ask for the verifiable credential. That credential has the globally unique identifier. The credential also has a signature from that person as well as GLIFE. This means that I have a cryptographically provable link between the person that I'm dealing with, the entity that I want to engage with, and GLIFE. So I can be sure that this is the person accredited by GLIFE to represent this legal entity. We've covered a lot, so let's distill it down. As humans, we build trust with a person by remembering the way that person has treated us over time. In a digital world, the way we prove things and therefore remember things is through cryptography. This means we need a strong binding between an identifier and that identifier's keys. Once we have that binding, we can hold that identity to account at some level for the actions that they take. When we have the ability to hold someone to account, we have the ability to build trust. Just as I have the right to be known purely on my own merit in the physical world, I should have the same right in the digital world. The technology exists to give us greater convenience, security, and autonomy. It's up to us to run with it.